Hello everyone. So I went on a trip to the Creation Museum in Petersburg, Kentucky. The drive took about 10 hours and I sat in the back where every misaligned piece of asphalt made its presence known at my expense. But despite the discomfort, spirits were high both with myself and the rest of the Bible study group that went on this escapade. We reached our hotel destination, which was known as the Baymont Inn before we got there, but after we got there it was apparently nameless. When we arrived at the museum, it was completely packed with people, much more so than you see in this footage because this was filmed later in the day when the lines died down. And before we ventured into the main exhibits, we walked around outside to check out the petting zoo area where we saw donkeys, horses, llamas, chickens, camels, and some other animals, many of which were bred in interesting ways on purpose to emphasize the capabilities and limitations of evolution within different kinds of animals. Once we were done there, we toured the surrounding areas where I decided to experiment on my ability to film upward towards the sky, blocked by a variety of trees, which occasionally allowed the sun to creep through to make the lens flare on my camera. There were some dinosaurs carved out from plants surrounded by Christmas tree lights, a whole bunch of gardens with various flowers, and right in the middle of it was a suspension bridge which seemed to be there for the sole purpose of crossing it with as much self-inflicted difficulty as possible. A make-believe mining plant where we could pretend to dig for fossils and other minerals, which we didn't spend much time at, but I had the opportunity to get some more water shots as I transitioned into the scene with a small waterfall, which were rather abundant in the outer gardens. But we didn't want to stay out there forever, so we made our way back, stopping briefly to wait for an unfortunate straggler, which allowed our adept photographer to take some photos of our senior married couple on a bridge. When we returned to the museum and we walked down the entranceway, I noticed how many references there were to dragons. From talking about the Roman recordings of dragons and the biblical reference of dragons known as Behemoth and Leviathan. The lobby was rather impressive, with the towering skeleton of a mammoth on display as a centerpiece before you venture further down the lobby to see robotic dinosaurs with children playing in the manufactured garden to express the point that humans and dinosaurs always coexisted with one another. While waiting in line to go to the main exhibits, there were glass displays of various sorts, one of which was known as the Seven Seas, which was the outline of the entire exhibit organization for the museum. The first of which was creation, describing the creation, corruption, which describes the fall of man, catastrophe, which describes Noah's global flood, confusion, describing the Tower of Babel and the confusion of languages that spread people all across the globe, Christ, to describe the ministry of Christ, the cross, which is to describe the death of Jesus on the cross and what it means for sinners, and the consummation, which describes the end of the world in which Christ will return and make his new kingdom. Then, of course, there were all these entertaining birds doing bird things and this chameleon doing very little, very slowly. The first exhibit was a room with a mock dig site which focused mostly on the fossils and how unreliable it was to date them using conventional carbon dating methods. Following this exhibit was another room that focused very much on comparing and contrasting the origin accounts of the world from what was told by the Bible and what was told by evolutionists. This room was a small taste of what we would later see in exhibits, as it illustrates the dangers that are associated with being an atheist and those who embrace evolution. This message specifically crosses out the word truth, as it draws attention to how truth becomes relative when the ultimate truth is rejected. Around the corner were more examples of unpleasant societal norms, being acted out to represent the downward spiral of moral society, with the first window showing a kid listening to ungodly music and his friend watching pornography in the background. The second window shows a teenage girl calling her friend to discuss the possibility of getting an abortion when she discovers that she's pregnant, highlighting the dangers of premarital sex and how one bad decision will lead to another until an unborn child is murdered for the convenience of the mother. This plaque reinforces the message of how one can't compromise the gospel and allow earthly teaching to corrupt the truth of God, as it will allow for the tolerance and encouragement of sin into the church. And it uses this giant boulder with millions of years written on it to specifically call out teachers who entertain the idea of old earth creationism. The next exhibit was more lively, with the idea of how the world may have looked during the time of the Garden of Eden, with a bunch of sculptures of animals and dinosaurs as you walked across the exhibit before you ran into Adam and Eve hanging out in the garden, looking like they were enjoying the life that God made for them, until you run into this depiction, with the two of them eating the fruit from the tree of knowledge, which interestingly enough, they depicted as berries instead of an apple. Then you run into the Walking Dead door, which introduces you to an exhibit with more depictions of the seriousness of sin, but it ends with this sign to remind everyone of the hope that we have in Christ. Later on in the museum, there was this really awesome robotic velociraptor doing velociraptor things, but what was equally eye-opening was this spider. I mean, look at the size of that thing. Ugh. There was a really impressive exhibit of the Ark, most of which I didn't film, but this is one of the models which they had Noah's family building the Ark. Later on, there was an impressive skeleton of a dinosaur, but more interesting than that was this glass case right next to it, which had the actual skull of the dinosaur, which was not displayed because it would rest on an apparently too weak of a pole because the skull was too heavy to be held by a single pole, in which the weight would eventually overcome the skull, causing it to break. After a few more exhibits, I reached the end of the tour, separated from the group. I was alone and unafraid, but I did eventually find some of them. We walked around some of the smaller exhibits to include the insects and these giant nope beetles. When the rest of the group caught up, we slowly made our way out to where we found the gift shop at the end, to which most of the merchandise was books. The books were primarily ones about creation and how the Bible answers questions of science, which is to be expected given that that's the theme of the museum. A notable exception was this book, which focuses on the danger of atheism and how it leads to the success of the Nazi movement and the rise of Adolf Hitler. But I didn't buy any of those books. Instead, I bought a book titled Already Gone, which is a book about young people leaving the church once they leave their parents and live on their own. A subject I can relate to because I'm often surrounded by people of my age who decided to forego attending church once they were able to do so on their own accord, with the occasional exception of attending a service when they go home to visit their parents. Quick side note here, I bought a latte from two nice ladies working at the coffee shop, and while I was there I asked them how they enjoyed working there and how often they see Ken Ham walking around. What they told me was a pretty common thing of all the employees, and when I asked them that question, they said that they enjoyed the people that they work with and noted how nice everyone was to one another. And as for Ken Ham, they said that they only occasionally see him walking around, and once in a while he'll go up to them and order coffee. But getting back on track, around closing time we sat around to try and figure out where to eat dinner, and where we eventually decided to go was City Barbecue, and then we left the museum. And then there was evening, there was morning, and that was the first day. Or second, depending how you look at it. The next day we went to visit the Ark, and when I got there we learned that the Ark was quite a ways from the parking lot, prompting me to hop on top of this pickup truck and take this really shaky image of the Ark. The Ark was very long, and as you stand back quite a ways you can get a full view, a challenge that our adept photographer had a field day accomplishing with her fancy camera. This ramp here is actually not the way to the Ark, it's just for show, and it has a stack of rocks to block the entrance. The actual entrance has you go through this little snake trail, through the metal bars, up this ramp, and then finally into this fancy room. I later learned these cages were one of many representations of how the museum assesses the family would have stored the animals, and even illustrated an elaborate system of food, air conditioning, and waste control that Noah's family may have used. One such estimate I found on the Ark estimated that each member of Noah's family would have been responsible for 850 animals, which means that the family's time on the Ark would not have been one of boredom, but one of chores. One of the more fascinating videos I watched that was on display was the making of the animal models, and how much effort it takes to make the fur just right, because you can't simply paste mass amounts of hair onto an animal model, otherwise people will call out how fake it looks. So in many cases what you have to do is sort of sew the fur onto the animal, sometimes one hair at a time, to get the realism of the animal properly represented. Then, after that tedious process is over, the artist has to paint the fur to become just the right color. And as they pointed out, animals in real life have multiple shades of color on every piece of hair in their body. So it takes hours of painting the amounts of hair on the model to get the representation even close to what it would look like in real life. But perhaps even more profound than that was this door. This is the door that connects to the ramp on the outside of the Ark that looks like the entrance but isn't. Right next to the door was a verse, John 10:9, which says, "I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved." This door on Noah's Ark represents the one way on earth that you can be saved. And it was open the entire time Noah was building the Ark, and for 7 days after Noah went onto the Ark. The profound message here is that while God's mercy is long-lasting and available to all, it is also finite, and one day in the future there will come a time when that opportunity ends and a new heaven and new earth is made. But after I was done pondering the symbolic meaning of doors, I looked at a bunch of these little exhibits that ran all through each deck of the Ark, and I eventually lost everybody and ended up outside alone and unafraid again. Until I realized that I wasn't, because I found my friend who had to leave, so I paid my respects before his departure, and I walked back to the Ark picking up a lemonade on my way, and I found the people that was going to go on this awesome zip line with me, to which I went on 7 zip lines, one after the other. Totally worth it. It was awesome. You should do it. Afterwards, it was getting to be the end of the day, so we took a lot of group pictures with the fancy camera. until finally we made it back to our bus and we drove through the night to get back home. Special thanks to Tom, Royce, and God's divine intervention for pulling off that long, tedious drive.